Tom Brady this morning, okay? We're going to try to help him out a little bit with that and help ourselves as well. If you're taking notes, the secret to perseverance. Number one, contentment in God. Contentment in God. In verse 11, Paul says, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstance I am. And in verse 13, he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Now that is a revolutionary statement right there in itself. Paul is saying he is not content in himself, but through God. That's a big statement to make, particularly during this time. Contentment was a key topic of ethical discussion in this culture, going back to the time of Socrates. Now, Paul runs into the Stoic philosophy all the time when he's on missionary journeys, and you can actually read about them, and particularly in the book of Colossians chapter 2 as well. And then even in Acts, this idea of this Stoic philosophy that contentment is found in yourself. Here's one of the quotes. In Stoic philosophy, contentment denotes the one who becomes an independent man, sufficient to himself and in need of no one else. The goal for the Stoic was that a man should be sufficient unto himself for all things and able by the power of his own will to resist the force of circumstances. So this was Stoic philosophy. And that statue right there, I'm sorry, I cannot remember who that is, but I do remember his quote. He says that the quality of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. So that you get the idea of that type of philosophy is that everything you are and everything you need to be depends on you. So when Paul says this in this letter to the Philippian church, he's attacking their culture by saying contentment is not found in you. You cannot cultivate it or just make it happen. It's actually found through God. It's a revolutionary statement then, and it's a revolutionary statement now, because being sufficient in yourself and resist the force of circumstances has worked for no one. No one has been able to accomplish this. The Stoic self-sufficiency philosophy it may sound great, but it doesn't match up with reality. And it also has two big things working against it. Number one, the eyes of man are never satisfied. That's Proverbs 20:27. We are never satisfied. We are after more and more and more. And then number two, working against the Stoic philosophy, humans are driven by their circumstances. We can't pretend that our circumstances aren't there. They are a part of us, and they have the ability to move us and make us feel ways and do things that we probably shouldn't do, or feel things that we probably shouldn't feel. And in 1 John 2:16, it says, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. You see, mankind is never satisfied, and we seek that which does not satisfy. So we're on this never-ending cycle pursuing stuff that doesn't satisfy. This has been true of every generation, going back to our first parents, Adam and Eve, when they partook of the forbidden fruit. And the problem is, we are broken. We are broken. You see, sin, what it does is it dims the glory of God, and then it depreciates the value of God. So when you see sex, money, cars, relationships, or even good works, what you see is satisfaction. And what you actually see is God. What a sinister place to be for us. We are broken. My friend says this, Pastor Eric Raymond of Redeemer Fellowship in Watertown. He says, the broken compass within us always leads to the dumpster rather than the 5-star restaurant. We are painfully off in our calibration. Never-ending cycle. We pursue contentment in what has been made instead of the maker of all things. And here's what's so sinister about our condition. Here's the thing, which is the most scariest thing, is we will never stop seeking contentment. You can't. You can't stop seeking contentment. Contentment is strong, gaping desire that's written on your hearts before the world even began. Look at Colossians 1:16 through 17. Listen to what it says. It says, "For by him all things were created, both in the heavens, on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities," get this, "all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So written on our souls is created through him and for him. So your job doesn't make you happy? It's not supposed to. Your spouse doesn't complete you? Your spouse could never complete you anyway. True satisfaction can only be found in our natural purpose, and that is for Jesus Christ. And it says we're held together by him. So that means two things. Number one, our bones, our DNA, all that stuff, everything, the whole world, we're all held together by Jesus Christ. The mouths that people use to blaspheme God, he holds those mouths together while they blaspheme God. All things are held together by him. But it also means that if your life feels like it's falling apart, it could be because you're trying to hold it together by something that can't. Because only Jesus Christ can do that. Jesus Christ holds everything together. Here's Jeremiah Burroughs. He wrote a lot on contentment, and he looks like he's very content, doesn't he? He's a Puritan writer. I mean, it's just a great book. It's like 99 cents on Amazon. But he says this, "My brethren, the reason why you do not have contentment in the things of the world is not that you do not have enough of them. The reason is that they are not things proportional to that immortal soul of yours that is capable of God himself." So what he's saying is our standards are way too low. What he's saying is we're trying to fill up ourselves with things that cannot fill us up because our body, our souls are capable of having God inside of them, are capable of being filled by God. So he's saying your standards are just way too low, way too low. So here's what happens when we talk about contentment. So I'm particularly talking to believers. So I'm just going to go out on a limb and say being content in God, that's not the first time you heard that. Today is not the first time you've heard that, correct? It's not the first time. You've read the scriptures, we've sang songs, we've even sang songs today about being content with God, right? So you start to look around and you start to say, I have a house, I have food, I have a family, I have a great church. You know, I am content in God. I am content with God. I don't have to be rich. And that's exactly what Paul is saying contentment is not. That is not contentment in God. Look what Paul says in verse 12. I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. If God takes away all of that stuff I just said, will you still worship? Will you still smile? Will you still seek his face? You see, Job, in the book of Job, he gets to this place in chapter 13 and 15, chapter 13, 15, where he says, though he slay me, I will hope in him. Now, Job, he lost everything. We know that. And he says, though he slay me, I will hope in him. So what that tells me is that contentment in God is way more powerful than circumstances. It's way more powerful than circumstances. So there's so many people who are on the wrong path to contentment. And so what Paul is trying to do is to get us on the right path, to turn us around. Because we're on the wrong path to contentment, and many of us are about to run out of gas. As we saw last Sunday, America is just getting more and more anxious. The suicide rate is continuing to go up. So Paul's trying to turn us around on that path, all right? Now, there are many pastors and scholars and people who talk about contentment and who have come up with definitions for contentment, all good stuff, great stuff, particularly drawn from this passage. So here is my attempt at a definition at contentment drawing from this passage, all right? Contentment is the internal, thankful, others-seeking spirit that rests in the providence of God. I'll say that again. Contentment is the internal, thankful, others-seeking spirit that trusts in the providence of God. Number one, internal. Verse 13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. This is Steph Curry. I don't know if many of you watch basketball. I watch a lot of basketball. This is one of the greatest shooters we probably have ever seen in the NBA. I used to coach basketball, and whenever a player would shoot too much or shoot crazy shots, you sit that guy on the bench. This player shoots from half court. I'm not making that up. You can go watch YouTube and see it. He is a great player. He has a shoe company. He has his own shoe with Under Armour. And you can't see it. I should have made it bigger, but it says on his shoes, all his shoes that go out, it says, I can do all things through Christ. So he's pointing back to this verse. He is a Christian. So they did an interview about that. And he says, this is how I get up for games, and this is why I play the way I do. Then the article goes on to say, no wonder why the 6'3" sharpshooter is basically unstoppable. He basically is unstoppable. Now I'll say this, no one in this room would want this verse more to be about basketball than me. I can tell you that right now. I love basketball. I wish that basketball was a spiritual gift. And seriously, I love it. And I'm not mad at Curry for putting Bible verses on his shoes, right? Kids are talking about Bible verses. I'm happy about all of that. But that's not what that verse means. In context, what this verse means is, I can persevere because Christ strengthens me. So contentment, first and foremost, is an internal work of God. When Paul goes to Philippi, he's tortured. He's put in stocks. Remember, we talked about this. Not stocks like the witches that we see in movies and Halloween. Real stocks that he's tortured. His body is put in these weird positions, and he's tortured while he's in Philippi. But here's what we see after that. At midnight, Paul and Silas, they're praying and they're singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. David, right? We know David. He talks about this being strengthened by God. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. You see, because we live in a fallen world, circumstances are always changing. And what God does is he gives his children contentment that's more powerful than our circumstances, whether they be good or bad circumstances. So it's not what's going on outside of us. It's what's going on inside of us. When we are weak, we are powered by his strength to persevere. Now, when we talk about God strengthening us, and I can do this too at times, I can be very vague about that. Just very vague. God strengthens me, and just very vague. What do we mean by Christ strengthens us in contentment? Well, it goes back to creation. We sometimes think that God created the world because he was bored, because he was discontent, whatever it is. And that's not true. God was in fellowship with his Son. He was in fellowship with the Spirit. God says he's well pleased with his Son. He's well pleased in himself. So God was content. So what that means is that creation is an overflow of God's contentment. God was pleased in the Son, and he wants to give his Son a people to worship. So we were created out of love. We were created out of contentment. So what God does is, because he's content in himself with the Trinity, because he's content in himself, we get that power too, to be content in him. And that's how we are strengthened. It's an eternal work that is given to us from God, first and foremost, where we are content with God and all that he is, because he is content in himself. So contentment is not found in strong-minded people. It is found in weakness. God infuses us with strength to be content. Contentment is also thankful, verse 18. It says, But I received everything in full and have abundance, and I am amply supplied. So contentment does not mean that you ignore problems. Contentment does not mean pretending that they don't exist. And it does not mean that we don't get to voice our complaints to God. But contentment is this: whether I have or I have not, I am okay. As Paul says in verse 10, rejoice in the Lord. So what Paul was saying, which sound rude to us, what he was saying was, whether you give or you don't, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will rejoice in the Lord for you. I will love you because my contentment comes from God. I am thankful. The danger in not being thankful is you become a complainer and you complain. And the danger in being a complainer is you are discontent. But what you're really saying is that you are discontent in God.